Now we're going to look at types of observational studies. And this first one, I don't know if they mentioned explicitly in the text, but this first type of observational study is called a cross-sectional study. And we're just going to look at one moment in time, one particular cross-section of time. Data are observed, measured, and collected at that particular point in time. So this is like perhaps the here and now of observational studies. Now, the next one is called a retrospective study. Okay, retrospective study. Or you might hear this referred to as a case control study. I think I've heard retrospective more often, and I kind of like it because it sort of tells you what's going on in that type of study. Because see right there, the word retro, it's like throwback data. So in a retrospective study, data are collected from the past. So something has already happened, and we are using that data, writing down observations maybe from past events and using those in our study. Okay, so that's retrospective. And then the third type here is a prospective study. Okay, prospective. Or this can go by some other names. It can also be called a longitudinal study. Okay, longitudinal or a cohort study. I think of those three, I've actually heard these two more frequently in like scientific papers and such. Cohort studies, longitudinal studies, but it's also called perspective. That kind of goes nicely with the word retrospective because these are opposites of each other. Um, so with a prospective or longitudinal or cohort study, the data is going to be collected in the future from groups called cohorts sharing common factors. So that's why we would call it a cohort study. But yeah, this is the type of study that goes long term and is going to track participants in the future. So perhaps you're trying to look at some effect of something that happens during childhood, for instance, like children who receive a certain medical treatment as a child, what happens to them in the future? That would be a prospective study or longitudinal study. If you have, different groups in that study, like maybe kids who received one dosage of this treatment versus another, they would form a cohort, a little group, and you'd track that cohort into the future to see what ended up happening with them. And that'll be your data in the future. So these take a lot of time investment, often also quite a bit of financial investment, but they can produce some really meaningful results. Okay, now we'll look at example 2 down here, where we'll determine whether an observational study or an experimental study was used. And in our first study here, a survey was taken to see how many times per week a person visits a fast food restaurant. That's it. um, so remember, observational studies, we are not influencing the outcomes. We're not manipulating any variables here. Experimental studies, we are trying to manipulate variables to look for cause and effect. So in this first description, there is no manipulation of variables being mentioned here. We're not going to like take away a person's refrigerator and see how often they visit a fast food restaurant or something. Nothing like that is being mentioned. It's just how many times do they go? So this would be an observational study. And if we want to get into a little bit more detail here, let's think about the types of observational studies we just saw. So thinking about which of these we might use in this case, you could do a cross-sectional study, like data from right now, point in time. How often is this person going? So we could use a cross-section. Or I also think we could use retrospective if maybe we have some data from the restaurants, perhaps, or retrospective. I'm not really seeing how we could do a prospective or longitudinal study with this. Yeah, because I'm not really seeing any cohorts in this particular scenario. So I think cross-sectional or retrospective, but it's definitely an observational study type of situation. Now, the next one here, a study was conducted to see if people who have pets walk greater distance daily than people who do not have pets. Okay, so again, this does not really mention any treatments. So we're not prescribing one group to acquire a pet and see if they end up walking more or anything like that. This seems to imply that we're looking at people who already have pets and how much they walk, and then people who don't have pets and how much they walk. This sounds like an observational study as well. Okay, now again, let's kind of break it down a little bit here. In terms of types of observational studies, we could also use a cross-sectional approach here. Okay, just looking at people at a moment in time. Or, I mean, I suppose we could use a retrospective study if people were tracking in the past how much they were walking. But I think this might actually be pretty well set up for a prospective or a cohort study here. Yeah, because we could make cohorts out of the two groups of people, a cohort who has pets and a cohort who doesn't have pets, and see, longer term what happens there, who walks more. So I'm going to say or prospective slash cohort study. Yeah. You could even see if people who don't have pets happen to acquire a pet in the future, although that might be getting a little complicated there. This is an observational study, though. Okay, no treatments are being applied. Then in C here, three groups of gamblers were randomly selected. The first group was given $25 in casino money. The second group was given a $25 coupon for food. The third was given nothing. After a trip to the casino, each group was surveyed and asked their opinion of their casino experience. Okay, well, I know which group I don't want to be in. This one, the group with nothing. Um, but thinking about what we have here, we've got three groups that were randomly selected, and each group is given something different. So that is prescribing a treatment to each group. The treatment is what they're receiving to use here. So this is an experimental study. All right, because treatments were applied. And we're seeking, it looks like, to develop some sort of cause and effect relationship if people reserve or if people receive this, some, casino money, if they receive some coupon for food, does that affect their opinion of their casino experience? So that cause and effect relationship also is indicative of an experimental study. Okay, so there we go, observational studies and experiments.